Hello, you're watching Eye on Africa. I'm James Creedon. Here are our headlines this evening. In Nigeria, tens of thousands are forced to flee deadly attacks by armed groups in Borno state in the northeast of the country. We'll bring you all the latest on that. The UN's humanitarian chief says that sexual violence and starvation are being used as weapons of war in Ethiopia's Tigray region. The conflict has claimed thousands of lives since November and displaced up to 1.7 million people. And it's a $7 billion industry that is growing ever faster across the African continent. Satellites and space exploration. We'll talk to the founder of Space in Africa, coming up a little bit later on. Thank you for watching. Now we start in Nigeria, where clashes continued on Friday between rebel groups and the army in the troubled state of Borno. The UN says as many as 65,000 people are fleeing that violence. The town of Damasak has seen 4 out of 5 inhabitants leave in search of safety. The UN says it will now struggle to bring aid to residents, many of whom had become largely dependent on food aid. Shirley Sitbon explains.
These residents of Damasak have fled their homes. The border town was attacked 4 times in under a week. Most of its inhabitants escaped south to Borno State's capital, Maiduguri. Others crossed into Niger.
The people of Damasak are desirous to stay in Damasak. However, because of the security situation, some have fled into the bush, some have fled into neighboring Niger for safety.
On Wednesday, suspected jihadists attacked the town as residents ended their Ramadan fast. For some 10 hours, they torched buildings, homes, local government offices, a police station. This was a clinic. Warehouses where humanitarians stored food aid were also destroyed, with gunmen searching for aid workers.
The situation on the ground is extremely critical. If this continues, it will be impossible, maybe for longer periods of time, for us to deliver aid to people who desperately need it.
Residents were already struggling here before the COVID-19 pandemic. Now their situation is even more alarming. Their town, Damasak, is located in a strategic area near Lake Chad. On the border with Niger, it's on a major road that is even more crucial now since other routes were recently flooded. Seizing the area would be a major gain for jihadist groups.
Now, Eritrea must withdraw forces from Ethiopia's Tigray region immediately, so says the US envoy to the United Nations. The statement comes as the UN's humanitarian chief told the Security Council that people are now dying of hunger in Tigray. Fighting broke out last November between the regional force, that's the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and the Ethiopian army. Eritrea has continually denied that its forces are also in Tigray, but Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has acknowledged their presence, saying that they would soon be leaving. Now, amid the humanitarian crisis, there are an increasing number of reports of rape by soldiers. Nicolas Germain has more.
This young mother in the Tigray region was a victim of sexual violence. She has been scarred forever. She says soldiers pulled her off a bus on the 6th of February on the road between the towns of Mekele and Adigrat. They tied her up and kept her for 11 days. Dr. Fasika was appointed by the government to head Tigray's health services. He says at least 829 cases of sexual assault have been reported in the region's main hospitals since the conflict began in November.
And these are people who are living close to the cities. Majority of people are living in the rural area. And so I would assume that the number that we have seen is the tip of the iceberg.
Victims have accused the Ethiopian army and its ally Eritrea of having committed these crimes. Both countries denied this. But Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed recognized that there had been rapes in the region, and he promised that the perpetrators would be punished. The government declared victory against the regional TPLF forces in November, but fighting has since continued in some parts of Tigray.
Now, the president of Congo Brazzaville, Denis Sassou Nguesso, took his oath of office on Friday. He won a landslide re-election on the 21st of March due to the main opposition boycotting the vote. Now, as he extends his 36 years of rule, the president promised to rein in the country's reliance on oil revenues to further aims, boosting industry and producing more homegrown crops over imported foods. Let's take a look at the swearing-in ceremony.
Je jure solennellement
I solemnly swear
de respecter et de faire
to uphold the Constitution,
la Constitution
to defend the nation
et de défendre l'État,
and the Republican form of the state,
de garantir
to guarantee peace and justice for all.
à tous
Time now for some other news stories from across the continent. The United States is imposing visa bans on Ugandan government officials due to the handling of elections in January of this year. The campaign was marred by human rights violations and other repressive acts. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that there must be consequences for the undermining of the democratic process. Tunisian authorities say they have recovered the bodies of 21 migrants after a boat sank off the port city of Sfax. The dead, including 9 women and a baby, were all from sub-Saharan Africa. The cause of that sinking is unclear. In Algeria, rights groups have sounded the alarm over 23 detained people who began a hunger strike over a week ago, calling for their immediate release. They are being held at El Harak jail for taking part in pro-democracy marches organised by the Hirak movement. That movement called for a sweeping overhaul of the ruling system in Algeria and saw Abdelaziz Bouteflika abandon his bid for a 5th term in office. Now to Rwanda next, where YouTube has become a space for freedom of expression for independent journalists. Channels such as Real Talk or Pax TV welcome politicians from all sides, even opponents like Victoire Ingabire, who was imprisoned for 8 years after being accused of minimising the genocide. Now, however, the platform is under increasing scrutiny by the government. A recent report by Human Rights Watch shows that various threats and arrests have been made against those who are using YouTube to speak out.
Chers téléspectateurs de Pax TV, nous vous saluons et aujourd'hui nous sommes avec le Dr Kamba Christophe. C'est un nouveau politicien.
John Williams Ndwale is a journalist who runs a YouTube channel on which he often broadcasts interviews with controversial figures.
Here in Rwanda, opponents are not well received in the mainstream media. They are not well received at all. When we talk to political opponents or people who want social economic change, often the Rwandan government sees us as an enemy of the state.
John embraces his right to freedom of speech. However, it has not come without cost. In 2014, he was forced to flee Rwanda after releasing a report that authorities did not like. Today, unlike many YouTube journalists, he has press accreditation. The Rwandan Media Council says that reporters who mainly operate on social media often break the law.
For example, we see cases where privacy is not respected. We see cases of slander. These types of abuses are committed by YouTube users. The viewers do not know how to distinguish between the work of a professional and the work of an amateur.
Operating in a grey legal area leaves YouTube journalists particularly vulnerable to crackdowns by authorities.
We have had bloggers being summoned, YouTubers being summoned by Rwanda Investigation Bureau to explain on some issues on some of their postings. Again, in this kind of framework, it's quite challenging, especially when their status as YouTubers is not fully protected by the law.
Human Rights Watch says at least 8 YouTube news reporters in Rwanda were threatened, arrested, and hauled before the courts between 2020 and early 2021.
Now, remember those beautiful pictures of Africa taken from space by the French astronaut Thomas Pesquet. Well, in just a few days, he will become the first European on board SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft on his way back to the International Space Station. But what of space programs in Africa? Currently, it's a big growth area, expanding by over 7% annually. Now, earlier I spoke to Temidayo Oniosun, who is the managing director of Space in Africa. Let's take a look.
In the past couple of years, the African space industry has been growing at a very fast rate. Currently, about 20 African countries have developed or in the process of developing a space program. 43 satellites have been launched up to date. 40 of those were launched by 11 African countries, while 3 of those satellites were multilateral projects where African countries came together to develop and launch them. Currently, the industry generates about $7.37 billion, and it is estimated that by 2024, the revenue segment of the industry would rise to over $10 billion. The national space agencies are also increasing the budget to space programs in Africa. In 2018, national space budgets from African countries was about $275 million. In 2020, this has risen to over $500 million. We're seeing a lot of countries trying to develop space programs now, working on satellite projects and capitalizing mostly on space technologies to address developmental problems.
Now, there's a lot of cooperation, isn't there, with Russia and China in particular on these satellite programs. Tell us a little bit more about that. And is there any reason to be concerned that it could also be an attempt to exert too much influence over African countries?
It's not really a problem. Most of the space programs in Africa are focused on, solving developmental challenges. So sometimes they work with countries like China, like Russia, France and all to develop some of these technologies, especially in the area of satellite technology development. But this is not really a problem, and it's not really about these countries exerting pressure or influencing all of these countries. It's all about how do we capitalize on space and satellite technologies to address different problems that African countries are facing.
Now, it's probably something you hear often and perhaps are sick of as a question, but is this an intelligent spending of resources by African governments? It's a $7 billion industry. Some would argue that money could be spent better elsewhere. What would you say to that?
First of all, when you look at the $7 billion segment, that is not the money that African countries are spending. That is the money that is being generated from this industry. So they're not spending that money. Like I said earlier, $500 million was Africa's space budget in 2020. And in 2020, over $7 billion was generated in this industry. And looking at what you're spending these resources on, it's mostly about solving problems. So take, for example, they capitalize on Earth observation, satellites and data to address problems around drought, monitor wildlife, do disaster monitoring and management, increase agriculture yields, grow industries, communities, and sustainable cities. And you see some countries that are capitalizing on communication satellite for telemedicine purposes, to monitor elections, to address the digital divide issues, and recently for remote education. So it is not money being wasted. It is money to develop an ecosystem that is generating immense revenue.
That was Temidayo Oniosun, Managing Director and Founder of Space in Africa, speaking to me a little earlier. Tonight's show was produced by Maya yet again. Thanks to her, and thanks to you for watching. Good night.